Hi, everybody. So this talk is not exactly aimed at a beginner audience, so bear with me, beginners. But basically, it is born out of frustration that we've encountered at Idealist while building complicated form UX and finding solutions that like almost worked but didn't, and then finding another solution that we were sure was going to work and then didn't. So we went through a bunch of those. And so sadly ended up building our own form validation and UI library. But yeah, so let's talk about forms. What's the big deal? You've got like inputs and people type in them, and then you submit them to the server, right? Um, but no, it's never like that. Um, what my experience as a web developer has borne out is that like flexibility is key because there's always going to be some weird snag that you hit, and so I'm always a little skeptical of form libraries that I'm just skeptical of form libraries. Okay, let's just say that. So yeah, let's get negative and then we'll go positive. Um, so if you have like a schema, and let's just to be clear, a schema here, we're saying like, oh, okay, we have a field named first name, and we're saying that it's a string, and it has to be at least one character long. That character could be like emoji or Unicode or whatever, but we want to say that it has to be at least one character long. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's going into a MySQL table and you can only put 255 characters in there or whatever. So you're saying that you've got a name that's a string between 1 and 255 characters. And so, great, there's your schema. Is that enough to display a form UI? No. There are so many like things that could possibly like go beyond that. Like, when do you want to show any validation errors that occur? Do you want to like immediately yell at the user before they've even typed a character? Do you want to yell at the user while they're typing? Or do you want to yell at the user after they blur the field? Or maybe you want to scream at them after they try to submit the form, those fools. So a schema is not sufficient to define a form UI. Another classic one is here's this form library, and it's going to give you a way to render a form, and it's going to give you a way to render a field or an input. But like, what about my form, man? My designer designed this really cool form, and it has this field structure that is just beautiful. But how do you take the design that your designer has come up with and then meld them into a form library? A lot of things fall down unless you're just willing to adopt whatever defaults that library gives you. Um, and then my personal favorite is when those decisions about validation are defined by the form library. And it's like, okay, but what about this one weird case when I need to validate merging server-side validation into the local validation, but only on the second Tuesday of every month? Just, these things happen. So if you have a large enough app, it's just not going to fly. You need to be able to take control from the library and define your own policies, define your own UI. You need to be able to work around the weirdness. And so basically, I want to be able to describe my schema, and I want to be able to do that in a like easy and flexible manner. I want to, at my discretion, pipe data through the validation, and then show those results to the user. I mean, that's what I want. So how can we get that? Or no, how does it all go wrong? I think I kind of like, okay, just some of the things that can go wrong is like live validation. When do you show it? And then yeah, managing server-side errors. So as promised, let's go positive. To me, like it's really important to say that the validation mechanics are separated as possible from UI concerns, meaning that like in the case of React, you can define your own beautiful form components, your field components, your input components, And to the extent possible, like they don't have any clue what's happening with the validation. They're just sort of stateless functional components. And you can test them however you want. For schema, we wrote this thing called Conformist, and it's actually a port of a Python validation library that our CTO wrote years ago that has like been in production for years, and it's a really nice UI. I'll just show you a little bit real quick how that works. So, you know, you have a type system. Everything is a type. Oh gosh. Yeah. So this is my sweet ASCII art. Everything's a type. There are scalars and containers, and scalars are just simple values like numbers, strings, bools, and enums are like enumerations of values like you might have in a select list. And then you have containers that are called lists and maps because this is designed to be work with immutable JS. So just how do you define a schema? Here is a simple schema that has a number and then a Boolean value that decides whether that number must be odd to pass validation. And so you can see it's kind of got like a fluent UI or developer experience. So it's a map of an integer named number and a Boolean named must be odd that's optional. And the entire map is validated by whether or not, you know, if must be odd is true, then it checks to see if the number is in fact odd. Okay, that is probably not the most useful schema in the world, but I just wanted to show kind of like what that interface looked like. And then the nice thing about this is you can just write your UI using plain old React components. I think I did. And then the glue is a set of things that we call form connectors. And that's what I'm going to talk to you tonight. I'm going to just kind of go over how to use them, and then if we have time and interest, I can go into how they work, which is kind of interesting. But basically, you take a form UI component, and then you form connect it. And that joins a conformist schema to a user interface element that you've defined. So that's sort of the top of it all. Inside, you have field connectors, which set up within that schema. We're going to say that we're talking about this one field or this group of fields. So you kind of think of a hierarchy of schema fields, and you can nest them as much as you want. Frequently, it'll just be like there's a form with one layer of nesting, and each field is going to correspond with one form field. But it can nest. If you have, say you have like a list of addresses, you could have a field connector around the entire list of addresses, and then a field connector around each address in that list, and then a field connector around each subfield of the address. And it just wires all that stuff up for you. And then finally, there's an input connector, and its job is to take a React component that has like an on change and hook it into this whole schema so that when you change your input, that gets projected into the form schema. And then it pushes through the validation so that if you want to, you can show it to the user. But that's up to you when you show those things. So here's a kind of crummy diagram that I put together where there's a form connector around the whole schema, and then there's field connectors around these ones, but this is showing how there's like a nested schema, and then inside of that you can see that there's an input connector around each subfield, and that's the thing that's going to actually hook up to the UI component. So without further ado, let's show some examples. Here is a simple form. There's got two fields and no CSS to speak of. First name and last name, and it has some really annoying error messages that are just showing to the user. And if I keep pressing letters, this is just showing the errors associated with the field. So as it starts out, it's saying, please don't have a freakishly short or long name. And as soon as I have 2 characters, it's going to be okay. And then once I have too many characters, it's going to yell at me again. And that's just constantly being updated as a result of typing in the field. And so I can make that validate. and then I make that validate, and then I can submit, and it's all good. But that's probably not how you want your form UI to work. Frequently, it's nice to let people type for a little while, and then once they blur the field, then you can yell at them. So that handles that, and then you can see how as soon as I blurred the last name field, it also showed the error. And I can make that go away and submit that. And then finally, I can do whatever I want to this all the time, and then, well, let's make it invalid. And then finally, once I submit, it's going to show the errors. And all of this is basically using the same code. It's a little bit boilerplate heavy at this time. I'd like to work with it. Let's take a look, actually. There's my CSS. Okay, so first of all, let's start at the top of the file that's actually not at the top of the file. Okay, so here's my schema. And it's got a string named first, and it's validated by a validator that says the length must be between 2 and 20 characters, and then the last name just has to be non-empty. So that's my schema. I have a form UI component that is just extremely simple in this case. It just spreads the props and then displays whatever's inside of it. My field component wraps it in a div, wraps it in a label, and then if it has a show error prop of true, it will show whatever errors have been passed into it from the field connector decorator. A quick sidebar, these @field connector things, what the heck are those? Why'd you put that in my JavaScript? Those are decorators, which basically just means it's the same as this. If you instead said actually, because classes are.
You just do class field and then wrap.
Oh yeah. So basically, it's just saying that you're going to call that function on whatever succeeds it, and so it just wraps it up. It's a cute little syntax that is available to you with Babel, which I won't even begin to get into. But we're all on the bleeding edge here, right? So let's see. There's a few different examples. Here's my live validation. There's a little bit of, again, boilerplate where you bootstrap the value of the form and the errors in the constructor. I can go into why, but I think it's sort of ancillary for now. And so here I am. I'm creating my form. I'm telling it what the schema is so that it knows how to validate it. And then I'm passing in the value and the errors that have been accumulated for it. And I have some callbacks. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this is that because of the way connectors work, you don't have to pass a bunch of props through. You don't have to wire everything up explicitly because it's using a feature of React called context, which really can make things very nice. And the reason is that you might have a very complicated application structure and you've worked very hard to make it all work, and then you might get a feature request to change that complicated application structure. And if you have just a cascade of props being passed down from component to component to component, your architecture is actually very brittle. And that means that refactoring and changing the physical nesting of components is going to be very difficult. And so this works around that issue.
Does the onSubmit actually hook into an actual forms onSubmit, or do you control that with a function called somebody on context?
In this case, I think it's triggered on a actual form submit, but I don't think that's necessary. Yeah. So as you can see, there's nothing going on here in the chain. In the on change, we're just updating the state, whatever's getting pushed through from the form into the the parent component. The blur example where we don't show validation until it blurs, there's a little, basically there's a way to say, whenever this input is blurred, we keep track of that. And then if it's been blurred, we're going to say show error is true. And if not, it's going to be false. So, but other than that, this code is largely identical to the previous example. So it's just an embellishment if you want to change it. And then the submit is, again, it's just tracking whether the form has been submitted. And once it is, then we pass show errors into the fields. And so they render the errors. There's one more example that I put together, which is of a more complicated schema. So this is hypothetically, I don't know, something about a meetup. And of course, our group is special. So, oh, look, you can add multiple names, etc. So I didn't really show this before, but this is just kind of, actually, let me go back to a simpler example. This whole thing down here is showing the value of the form as you update it. So you can see that the field called first has this value and the field called last has this value. And currently there are no errors, but as soon as I change it, then it gets pushed into this. And that way you have the ability to look at the entire hierarchy of the form at the root if you need to. I think that's it for the examples.
Can you show the code for the complex one?
The complex one, yeah, it has one. I realized that the button that lets you add a name is a little confounding. It's a feature that I hadn't encountered, so I had to basically write some library code in my application as I wrote this example about an hour ago. Yeah, I need to find a way to expose methods that let you work with the more complicated schema types. Because you want to have, like, if you have a list of names, it would be nice to say, like, list of names dot append a new name or a blank name. But there currently isn't one. I have a couple ideas, but it hasn't, I don't have it yet. But so here you can see I've got the top level fields for the group name and the specialness of the group. And then inside a field set, because HTML is awesome, I have a legend that's for all the names in the group. And then I just iterate over the names that I have, and then I pop a name field component in. And what I'm using to hook it up is a path. So like, let's see. If I go back to the schema, you can see that at the root of the schema, there's three fields: group name, special, and names. And then that names key is a list. So I'm using the index of each value in that list to construct a path. And then once I have that path, the name field component here is able to just look at that one specific subfield of the schema and have the right first and last names there. Yeah, and so that's able to just entirely, it uses a field connector itself to say, I'm going to route to one part of the schema, and then the subfields just all kind of work out. Yeah, so I think the schema definition is simple and easy to understand. It's at least clearly separated from your UI. The UI components are very simple to test because they're pure. At least they can be pure if you want to. There's nothing, there's no assumptions that are being made about the schema directly in them because it's just being passed in as props, which means if you want to do like shallow rendering in your tests, it's all easy and good to go. And we've found a lot of success with that at Idealist. And then my personal favorite is that your fields and your form inputs and everything have the tools available to them to do the validation through the context, which I can show you. But basically, like, I like to think of this as a toolkit rather than a library, which lets you build your own UI library the way that your designers want, and then you hook things up. It's just the glue. So there's some stuff to do, like documentation. There's that type diagram and some examples, but there's a bunch left over. I would like to definitely improve some of the rough edges and maybe publish it to NPM. So I refactored the entire repository structure like 2 days ago, and I was like, oh, I'll have it done in time for the. But in the meantime, it is available on GitHub, drd/conformist, and it's currently on a feature branch while I clean up the dust, but I should have it all pushed to master and published this week. Oh, one more to do. Yeah, I wanted to just, it can be more granular. So sorry, this is where I was trying to go. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Ooh.
Do you have any affordances for hooking into like the dirty, active, what the other one, the touched and pristine states, like the form and the elements? Like that's.
Are you saying like whether it's ever been?
Yeah, like if you're on a certain field that's active, and maybe you want to do some changes to your validations in that state, or the form is pristine, hasn't been touched, or it's dirty, or something like that. It's one of the few things that, not one of the few things, one of the things that came out of Angular's form validations. It was really nice. So it's like, is there any sort of affordance for that, or do you think
There's
it'd be easy
nothing...
to like add in if one of us wanted to hack on it?
The same concept with the blur, and say this.dirty, and then on the on change you would say this field is now dirty and it's been edited. So you could use that same concept, right?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything stopping you from doing it, but it's not like a first-class concept at this time.
So right now that state would be maintained in like one of the consumers of the library.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, I think that would be a very worthy contribution to make.
Right on. Yeah, I'm on
it. You're him.
Yeah, I'll speak loudly. Okay, I'll speak into a mic.
He ran fast enough to make you feel
fancy with a mic. So I noticed in the like state representation in your examples that there was like a property called self on the inputs.
Yeah.
Which I thought like, oh, that doesn't seem. What does that do? What is that there for?
It's just there. I'll show you the. It could be called this if you prefer. Basically, it's a way. So let's see. That is actually just in the errors representation, and it's because the hierarchy, like as you recursively traverse over it, having a self versus a children concept just makes it a lot easier to work with. But it's not something that generally you as an application author are going to have to worry about. It's kind of abstracted away by the library. It's mostly just a convenience of not having to depend on a one-to-one mapping between like JavaScript types and like schema types. Yeah. Ian.
So what's the actual like API surface area? Is it just that connector, that little higher order thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's that's the main API, and then once you're in there and you're defining a form or a field, there's certain context types that you have access to. So if you need to inspect the entire form state in your form component, you have access to that. You have the ability to update and validate fields on callback. There's before submit hooks, which we ran. It pained me so much to write that, but our rich text editor doesn't reliably push updates through unless you hit the spacebar. So yeah, thank you. That way is just like right before you submit, punch the value in, like go reach into the iframe and get that value. Yeah. Software engineering.
Okay, so but there aren't any actual components.
No, there's none. I would like to probably provide a default set of components, or maybe like a library, but like the idea is that you could hook this up to almost any React form component library that has the right signature, and most of them do. It's like, yeah, onChange is a value, and you can define all those different events that you want to from your field to hook into it. I'm sure there's more work to do in terms of like meeting all of those corner cases, but it's very flexible.
Cool.
In the back.
Is it?
Yeah. I'm running around with the mic because we're taping this for later, so I want to make sure the questions get captured.
Cool. Thanks. So I wondered with the sort of DSL you have for saying like this value must be, like an integer between these values or whatever.
Sure.
I wondered if you'd seen a library called Ramda and sort of considered that at all. It looks like what you've got there is very sort of succinct and it does just the things you need. So that's pretty nice. Like you're not pulling in a big dependency, but that library has just like a plethora of methods to sort of create a function by just calling a bunch of functions, which is sort of what you're doing there.
Sure. If you're referring to the validation, that validation library is sort of optional. There's multiple packages. I didn't really go over that, and my tree view is extremely small. But the schema package, which is just the different types like map and list and num and bool and all that, is separate from the validation library. You can use any function that has the right signature as a validator. So I'm pretty sure, I won't guarantee it, that you could define all of that you wanted with Ramda or anything else.
Cool. I have another question maybe too. Okay. I was just wondering, like it looks like on GitHub that you split the package into two things to take Conformist itself. And so what you're going to do is publish it as Conformist being without React and a React Conformist package. Is that what's sort of going on right now? Or
Yeah, sort of along the lines of how Babel does the monorepo thing. It's even like he has a tool that he wrote to do that. Yeah, I mean, you could use the schema definition and validation libraries with whatever you wanted or nothing. And then this is just the React bindings. Perhaps it's, me dreaming a little too hard, but yeah, it is a generic library, so I didn't want to tie it to React necessarily.
Cool. Thanks.
It's kind of independent to what you just mentioned, the UI part. Would this work out of the box for, let's say, React Native? Or are there any kind of...
I don't think there's any really hard dependencies on React DOM. I haven't done anything in React Native with it, but I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, it'll just work out of the box. But if it doesn't, let me know. Any other questions? Wait, Mike, was that a question? Oh, cool. All right, well, thank you all. It's been a pleasure. And I have one last slide to express that. So, good night.